Thanks, Andy and Ian in the organizing committee, all of you, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It is somewhat intimidating to be coming back here. And it does certainly feel like it never left. And so I'm hoping that I actually might have something to say that would even vaguely interest you. But perhaps by going back a little bit, a very important point in this process was that 10 years before Sydney, we hosted the World Parks Congress here in Durban in South Africa. And it was indeed a turning point in a transformative democracy of South Africa, but there were some really key messages that were put across in Durban, including through the patron of the Congress, Nelson Mandela, who really made a plea and sounded a warning that conservation wouldn't work if you couldn't engage people and make conservation relevant to them. And so I thought I'd just have a look. Andy talked a little bit just now about how things change and how maybe they don't change. But if you look over the 50 years of the World Parks Congresses, there were some staples, some really important things about understanding ecosystems, understanding threats, moving down, dealing with issues of legislation, capacity development, working with international conventions, partnerships, development issues, regional planning, and so on. But it was only in Durban that the word governance came up for the first time. The idea that one really had to look at the issue of rights, of justice, equity in conservation. And that was a landmark. It happened in South Africa and has changed the whole way the world thinks about conservation globally. One of the things that wasn't listed there was highlighted by Andy, and that was climate change. Climate change was not discussed in 2003 in Durban, in South Africa. Yet, just 5 years later, we were busy trying to influence global policy on climate change to address issues of biodiversity. And it's always interesting to me, that question about, we're sitting here talking about stuff we think we know about, and then we have blind spots. We're not thinking about other things that perhaps are in the room, but we're not focusing on them. Yet, in 5 or 10 years' time, they will become, complete imperatives. So, just a year after Durban, and building on all of that good work, was the first time a global agreement had been reached on protected areas through the Convention on Biological Diversity in Malaysia. And that developed a program, a plan. And it's an interesting, it's an inflection point that perhaps we could dwell on. It was a plan, a set of things to do. It's written like that, so we should do these things. Measure populations, look at this, look at that. A kind of prescription. But you will see that element 2 on governance, participation, equity, and benefit sharing was put in place. However, it's still one of the weakest areas of implementation globally. There's always a tendency to get back to program element 1, which is about planning, selecting, establishing, strengthening, managing. And even when I looked across your program for the symposium, about half of what you're talking about is in that box. Much more is into the involvement of people than it used to be, and also in mainstreaming biodiversity into the issues of the challenges that face the planet. So, especially policy. And he talked about political science, not so much political science per se, but ensuring that public policy, which is where public funding comes from, does integrate the concerns of biodiversity. And that was the initial message of the convention, and is still a challenge for everybody today. So fast forward to 2010, when the strategic plan for biodiversity was adopted, you see a little bit more of an outcome-oriented type of planning. So it's not what should we be doing, but why. And the why became about securing the planet's variety of life, contributing to human well-being and poverty eradication, and the how was about maintaining resilient ecosystems. So if you like, the issue, the focus on the loss of biodiversity wasn't the primary purpose of the strategic plan, but making the linkages that would essentially ensure sustainability. So I'm not going to dwell on the HE targets at all, but most of us that work in this world, this is a really interesting formulation of a goal, which is due to be performed by 2020. I would have written it the other way around, because unfortunately, the focus has always been on, well, let's up the percentage of the areas that are protected, rather than the qualitative elements of the target, which are around making sure that management is effective, or that governance is equitable, or that this is integrated into the wider landscape and seascape. And I think we have a tradition in South Africa of getting that integrative focus in place. But it's just interesting, if you want to get into the world of policy, the way policy is formulated, then it rolls out. So, you know, donors will pick on at least and then start providing funds for establishing new protected areas, when you might say that's not the issue. The issue is actually connecting them, or whatever else it happens to be. So, yeah, this is a lifetime kind of thing to do. Maybe Ian organizing a symposium on contemporary conservation practice is a challenge. I organized one of these. In fact, the first time I stood on this symposium was 38 years ago. So just for those new people that are here, don't be too... You're going to be here for a long time if you're going to stay this game. But 6,000 people gathered in Sydney, and they wanted to ask the question, okay, so what? If we've got the plans, we know what the world needs, we know how to do that. So how do we challenge ourselves? And what was quite interesting was to come out with something different, a kind of a commitment, a promise that some things needed to change, that if we fast forward 10 years' time and look back, what would have happened in that time? Not what should we do from now, you know, step by step, but try to make the jump. And I think we have that opportunity before us all the time, is to think about when the elevator door opens, you know, 10 years down the road or 50 years down the road, what will the world be like, and what can we do now to shape it? The three big elements are predictable in the sense that there was a concern that the world was going backwards, and there needed to be a scaling up, and it all needed to be effective. But there was another return to this concept that really conservation had to be something that involved people in fundamental ways, and that we had to rekindle, if you like, a love of nature, because that love persists and dominates how people think in the world. And then ultimately, I think for the first time, the issue of relevance really came to the fore. So we weren't just talking about climate change, we were talking about health and well-being, food and water security, peace and security, a whole range of issues that hadn't been tackled before. And another thing changed, which is also interesting, and South Africans were also part of this, was to say, look, we can doggedly go through all of these different things, sign up to these agreements, you know, promise to do whatever we like. But there was, and it was also inspired by the Durban Congress, when the president of Madagascar said, I'm committing in 10 years to treble the size of the protected area state. Well, he stood up again in Sydney to treble the size of the marine protected area state. But so did 57 other parties. And it was really interesting to say, well, it's not, you know, we're not just going to do this thing in a maybe an uncommitted, insincere way. We will put our money where our mouth is and say what we're going to achieve as we go forward. And I think that was very interesting. So we ended up with this kind of shorthand formulation. And what I want to do this afternoon is just to touch in on each of these three bubbles, parks, people, and planet, to give you an indication of what we're trying to do in IUCN. IUCN is an international organization. Ezemvelo KZN and its predecessors are founder member of IUCN. WWF is a member of IUCN. So we have 1,500 members all around the world. Government, so it's an intergovernmental organization, but also an organization that embraces non-governmental organizations. And we can try and influence what people do. And so we had to think to ourselves, what could we change that would make a difference to what you're all trying to do? and the dilemmas that you face. Conundrum is one of the words. Dilemma is another one. So just to touch on this first green bubble, the area around protected and conserved areas. The protected and conserved is deliberate because there is a tendency around the world to think of protected areas as those areas that are designated by governments, governed by governments, and managed through government agencies. But the hidden conservation is much greater than that. If you look at the other actors in conservation that are conserving biodiversity, they may not be recognized, but they're out there. So what we are trying to do initially is based on good science, based on good practice, was to come up with something that would really attest to performance. A slide disappeared that I had there. Anyway, okay. And so in fact, it was a discussion that we had in Somerset West in South Africa. Someone said, well, why don't we have a red list of protected areas? And we said, well, that is the most idiotic suggestion anyone has ever made. Imagine going to a government and saying, you have the worst track record, and we want to work with you to fix it. It's like you're just not going to get anywhere. So it was suggested in that meeting, why don't we think about a green list process? And so since 2008, we've been working on this idea of an international standard, a minimum standard of performance that all protected areas could aspire to. And then, of course, the devil is in the detail, because one needs to then get under the skin of that and say, well, how would you measure performance against a whole range of criteria? Pete Goodman's in the room, and I remember Pete arguing for the introduction of management effectiveness assessment through the protected areas of KwaZulu-Natal. That's great, and the world has agreed to do that. But what it has shown is that more than half of the world's protected areas are either dismally managed or not managed at all, or managed inadequately to actually contribute to the values that they are supposed to conserve. And only a really small percentage, about 14–15%, you could consider to be managed effectively. So we were trying to say, well, how can we do that better? And so introduced this process of trying to strengthen area-based conservation outcomes focused on the values for which the areas are established, that would then also be able to channel capacity development. So if you know what you're not doing, and you know, well, what you're not doing well, then you can target that for investment and capacity building. We also, in discussion with donors, with the development banks, and other investors, realized that people want a return on investment, and you need to be able to show where their money is going. So again, we saw this green list standard as being a vehicle for a metric, if you like, for measuring that. And I'll come back to that theme a few times, I think. Anyway, the green list is a sustainability standard. We have introduced it using international practice, or the international standards for actually developing sustainability standards, like the Marine Stewardship Council or the Forestry Stewardship Council. And it's based on essentially three main pillars: effectiveness of management, governance, and design and planning. But then in the middle of all of that is really the conservation outcomes. And I see there's some talks on the program that'll look at conservation outcomes more deliberately. So if you establish an area, to conserve the outstanding universal significance of the Okahlamba Drakensberg Park, then you've got to look at how well are you doing on that metric. And measuring not only biodiversity outcomes, but social and economic outcomes is not a trivial exercise. And I'm hoping that all of you as researchers and scientists will focus in on this. So it's not so much what you do, but keeping an eye on where is it heading, and are we actually getting there? And of course, we can get stuck in that quite a lot. I don't have time today, but I'm here for the whole of the week, and I have some brochures, but we have developed 17 different criteria that would be the proxies for measuring performance of protected and conserved areas, and a lot of guidance that goes behind all of those. An area to be listed on the green list would have to qualify on all those criteria. It's not a case of cherry picking. We're really great on our biodiversity outcomes, but we haven't solved the social issues. And maybe this is a good point for me to mention that often we forget that incentivizing performance isn't just at the agency level or at the national level. It's at the level of all of you that actually make it happen. There can't only be 5 minutes left. So how much time is there left? Because I haven't been speaking for 25 minutes. Yeah. Keep going. Yeah, okay. No, it's a bit off-putting. So the issue, though, is to see the absolute pleasure in where management teams are able to stand on a platform, perhaps with their minister, with their partners, and actually be recognized for what they've managed to do. So we introduced this in Sydney as a pilot and provisionally listed a number of sites around the world, but quickly learned that we've also got to look at how to grow that capacity. It can't just be a once-off measure and say, well, you didn't make it, sorry. We had to start thinking about people as being candidates and then working to improve what they were doing and slowly up the game. So that's where the raising the bar, if you like, comes from. And I'm happy to go into this in discussion and so on during the week. We deliberately did this in a geopolitical way. We needed to look at which countries in the world would be interested in this. We piloted it, of course, in Australia because of the Congress, but also in China, in Kenya, in Colombia, in Mexico, in Spain, Italy, and France. And we got many commitments from countries to go further, including from South Africa. So we're interested in engaging with you. Just last year, we managed to get that into international public policy, the recognition that a lot more needed to be done to look at effectiveness and outcomes of protected areas and to use this IUCN Green List as a voluntary standard. So, that's the game that you have to play, is making sure that governments understand that's their commitment, but it empowers what you do, where you are. And that's what political science and conservation is all about. Public funding, public policy. So that's one take home. Can you give me an update on how much time then I can be? You've got about 5, 6 minutes. Okay, then I'll skip through. So in a similar vein, and one could spend much more time, and maybe we'll have a chance to do that, we could talk about equity and justice. I wanted to go into this a little bit further. The governance outcomes of the Durban Congress were to take the IUCN categories, the 6 categories of different kinds of protected areas, but crosswalk them against the different kinds of governance. So shared governance in transboundary conservation, but also governance by indigenous peoples and local communities, governance by private actors, or governance through governments. And when you open up that matrix, you end up with an incredible diversity. So that's the first issue, recognizing the diversity of people that are involved in conservation and distinguishing between governance and management. So I won't try and do that now, but there's often a tendency to conflate those two issues. Who makes the decisions? Who carries them out? And we've spent a lot of time developing ways of doing governance assessment. I wanted to just jump in just very briefly to, whoops, that wasn't me. Unless it's a, oh, there we go, it's back. So just very briefly, governance really is involved with the recognition of rights, procedural justice, and also the issue of costs and benefits and how they're distributed. And understanding that, I mean, I'd be really fascinated to hear how any of you are looking at that issue, not just about costs and benefits, but how do you go about recognition? How do you go about procedural justice? So I'm going to jump across that. And of course, I mentioned privately protected areas. And then there's this other big issue about other effective area-based conservation measures. There's a tendency around the world with these new targets for people to try and pack the targets full of things that wouldn't really qualify, that don't actually conserve biodiversity. And those could be things like, semi-natural areas in municipal parks or forests that are managed commercially for timber supply, or fisheries closures that are not intended to conserve the ecosystem, and things like that. So we're really struggling at the moment internationally to characterize what counts and what doesn't count in conservation. So I wanted to then touch on the issue of solutions very briefly. We spent a lot of time early on saying, look, the climate change issues is mostly around social justice and the cost of that in the world. How do we get biodiversity into the picture? And so being very deliberate about developing evidence for why climate change was, or why biodiversity and protected areas were crucial elements of contributing to climate change was one of our agenda. So that's where we started, making the case for mainstreaming. And we've done that in a number of different areas, and it's still an ongoing issue. In disaster risk reduction, in human health and well-being, and I mentioned others earlier. But what we've tried to do is to develop a platform which we're calling Panorama, where we disaggregate this learning. It's very easy to package a story and say, well, this is how working for water works. But why does it work? Is it about governance? Is it about the science? Is it about, what is it that works? And so we've been working out a way of trying to find, and also instead of problem solving, solution seeking. So look for what's working and try to understand why it's working and what characterizes success, rather than the other way around, which is to say, here's a problem, and how do we deconstruct the problem, and how do we solve it? And so it's essentially prospecting for success. And we're finding this extremely interesting, that we're able to develop so far a platform of 300 different solutions, all disaggregated into different issues. Just to mention one example, in Palau in Sydney had made the case that the country's economic development was absolutely, totally dependent on the marine environment in their exclusive economic zone. Most of those resources were being stolen by offshore fisheries. So they had decided over a period of 5 years to declare the entire exclusive economic zone a marine protected area, and to make sure that all the benefits of it flow into the Palau economy for its tourism, for its domestic food consumption, and addressing issues of climate change. So this is incredible. Here's the smallest country in the world, just about, making one of the biggest changes to be, like a large ocean state, with its economy dependent on the biodiversity of its marine environment. And we were recognizing that story just recently in Chile at the Impact Conference, where Keobel Sukuma was the winner of the Kenton Miller Award for this innovative approach that they're going on. So I wanted to commend this to you. Look for the successes. They can be much more modest than Keobel's largest marine protected area in the world, but not. Anyway, so perhaps getting to the end of what I've got to say today, I think this is where we're going. We have got to figure out how these worlds intersect, how the world of protected and conserved areas will make a dramatic contribution to all those things. And to do that, we are going to have to develop the right kind of capacity. I know I don't have much more time to talk, but I think one of the things that's sadly missing in the world of conservation is the professionalization of these disciplines. It's one of the, if you add up the total area of the earth that is under protected and conserved areas, it is vast. It's more than 25% of the planet. And yet we still don't have professional bodies, professional recognition of the practice of conservation. And I think we're neglecting that. I know people are concerned about qualifications and about training and guidance and all the rest of it, but we have not brought that through to be a powerful profession in its own right. So we could talk about that more, but I really, perhaps I wanted to, I'm going to just go back one step to the issue of financing, because at the end of the week we're going to talk a little bit more about financing of protected areas. This study by McKinsey that WWF commissioned showed on the left-hand side the current level of investment and predicted that we needed globally 20 or 30 times that amount of money. So the question was, where's that going to come from? And it could come from perhaps more commitments by governments, but it's unlikely to. So the big brown bars are really conservation investment that's going to come from other sources, impact investment, people who would invest in biodiversity for a whole set of other reasons. And so maybe we'll have more time on Friday to discuss this in the financing issue. But we really feel that if we can find a measurable way to show what an investment can achieve, then we've got much better chance of actually attracting the kind of impact investment that would fill the gap. And so that concept of what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? What is the gap in capacity and finance to get there? And who's most likely to fill it is something that this standard that we're developing, we think fits right into that. It's a diagnostic tool that would help us to understand better this task that we've set ourselves and undertake positive steps to develop it. So with that, quality, justice, and solutions all held together by a new kind of capacity and a new will to achieve that, I think that's what I'm hoping we're able to talk about more this week while we're here. Thanks so much.